Hey guys, and welcome to the waste portion of the Lean Basics series. Now, I'll start you guys out in this section with a small story about waste, and then we'll break down the types of waste in further detail. One form of waste that really bothers me is wasted time on an airplane. Airliners are measured on this metric called on-time departure. This is a measure of when an airplane pushes away from a gate compared to the time it's scheduled to depart from the gate. This may sound like a great metric, but it hides a very sinister form of waste. We rush to get everybody on the plane, then we push away from the gate and taxi to the runway, then we stop. Then the pilot comes on in his very polished pilot voice and says, "Hey folks, this is the captain from the flight deck. Looks like there's quite a traffic jam out here right now. Some weather on the East Coast has put a stop to takeoff for the last hour. Looks like we're going to have a delay for the time being. We're number 65 for takeoff. We should be off in the next 2 hours. In the meantime, feel free to sit back, relax, and I want to thank you for flying Muda Airlines." The tower knows there's a jam, yet the airline decides to push away from the gate to meet their performance metric. Why couldn't we have just done the sensible thing and push away from the gate when the runway was clear? This way, passengers could remain in the relative comfort of the airport while the jam clears up. Take a moment to think about the metrics you use to measure performance in your organization. Do some of them have sinister side effects like on-time departure? We often create waste when we have the best intentions in mind. So the three main categories of waste are Muda, Muri, and Muda. Muda is the waste that we're going to break down into 7 smaller subcategories that Taiicho Ohno introduced to us. Then we'll go into Muri and Muda, which are the 2 siblings of this bigger form of waste. So let's start with Muda. Muda is the Japanese term for waste, and it's broken down into 7 categories and is generally accompanied by Muri and Muda. People feel victimized by Muda, like they can't do anything about it, but it's actually a byproduct of your action and your human thought. So in a lean environment, we work to eliminate this. Muri is the Japanese word for overburdening or to place an unrealistic expectation on something. So this can be done to a human being or a piece of machinery. Now I've noticed at certain supermarkets that they try to keep the costs down by only opening up a few cash registers. Pretty soon the lines are out the door, and this is a form of Muri on that poor cash register employee, because there's no way that that single cash register employee can keep up with all those customers that continue to flow in. Another form of Muri that I saw recently was on a cruise ship. Now, because everybody's in such tight quarters, there's high risk of viruses breaking out. To mitigate this, they go ahead and put hand cleaning stations in front of each of the dining areas. Now, when the lines get too long, generally you see a huge portion of the people passing by without using them. So that's a form of Muri, because that one station cannot service all of those people. Now, Muda is the Japanese term for unevenness. Now, if you go to a grocery store, you'll notice that certain lines will have more people in line than others. That is a form of Muda. You also notice that depending on the time of day, lines will be longer and shorter. Again, that's a form of unevenness. So in a recent trip to Walmart, I noticed how they were attacking Muda. They have a digital board that tells the customer which line to go to. So once the cashier clears a customer, a button is pushed, and then the digital board lights up with that particular cash register's number. The next customer proceeds to that cash register. This is a way of evening lines and fighting Muda. So back to Muda. Here are the 7 categories you've been waiting for. They are overproduction, waiting, movement, overprocessing, inventory, motion, and rework. Now I know that's hard to remember, and I've seen some really good mnemonics that people use to remember this, or some acronyms like Cost Down or Tim Wood. All of them are great. Sometimes I've seen more than 7. I've seen up to 11 different forms of waste. So the main takeaway from this is waste can come in many different forms, and you need to train yourself to see all of them in whatever working environment you're in. Overproduction is producing anything more than is needed at that exact moment. Taiicho Ohno considered overproduction to be the worst form of waste. Now you may think that producing a few more products than needed at any given time is harmless. Overproduction may also seem like a smart choice when setup times are high, but I'll tell you from experience that it often comes back to haunt you. I've personally seen managers overproduce in large batches in the name of efficiency. We later found out that the entire batch was defective. Remember all these planes that we produced ahead of time? They were all defective. Those costs can never be recovered. The waste of waiting is any idling you see by operators. So do you recall seeing operators idling at times? It's rare that workers wait around for no reason. It's been my experience that workers generally feel nervous when waiting. Waiting can be caused by poor machine maintenance or an imbalance in the production line. It can cause poor morale, and if left uncorrected, can breed laziness in the workplace. Some more active employees will go looking for work instead of idling and inadvertently overproduce parts that aren't needed. The waste of movement is moving around product or inventory. Movement in itself never adds value to a product. Movement should be minimized by placing workstations as closely together as possible in sequence of production. Notice how much movement the material handler is going through just because the workstations are not in optimal sequence. Obviously, the material handler is not adding any value to this process. Next, there's overprocessing. This form of waste is pretty tricky unless you interact directly with your customer. Manufacturers often assume they know exactly what a customer wants and spend valuable resources trying to meet these phantom demands. The customer is often indifferent to the added burden the manufacturer puts on itself. Toyota, for example, used to paint the inside of their bumpers. When they realized customers just didn't care, they stopped doing it. The costs in the form of paint, time, and manpower were taken out of the total cost of producing the automobile. Notice how the operator is overprocessing his part beyond the requirements needed by the next workstation. He may think he's helping the company, but processing anything beyond true customer requirements is waste. Next is inventory. Inventory can take the form of raw material, work in process, or finished goods. It's probably the most complex of the waste to understand. When properly controlled, inventory can be an excellent tool to protect ourselves and our customers from stockouts. Most of the time, inventory is abused, tying up valuable resources and bringing cash flow to a halt. Do we really need this much inventory in the form of work in process to keep the production line running smoothly? Next is the waste of motion. Wasted motion is any movements taken at a micro level or operator level that do not add value. Don't confuse this with movement, which is the shifting of product or work in process. This form of waste happens at the workstation and robs us of precious seconds repeatedly during production. It must be eliminated because it not only takes time, but it also contributes to quality defects when the operator adds different non-value added motion to building a product. For example, does this operator really have to shift his piece so many times before starting work? He has wasted precious seconds through superfluous motion. Next is the waste of rework. Right after overproduction, I'd consider this to be the worst form of waste. In fact, overproduction and rework generally work hand in hand. Rework is a definite morale killer and must never become part of a working culture. Keep in mind that all costs associated with creating product the first time around cannot be salvaged, which is the explicit cost of rework. The fact that your precious resources in the form of manpower are not available during periods of rework is the implicit cost of rework. In other words, what could you be producing right now if you weren't reworking these defects? Most importantly, note that if you're reworking product, it means there's a very unhappy customer somewhere out there. You can only test a customer's patience so many times. So let's recap on Muri and Muda. We'll relate Muri and Muda back to the simulation. Remember the second run, which was mass production? The work each station had to do was imbalanced. Worker 1 only had to do 1 fold, while Worker 4 had to do 4 folds. This is a classic example of Muda. There's obviously an imbalance between the amount of work performed by stations 1 and 4. This is also an example of Muri placed on Worker 4. He was struggling to finish all 4 folds and often fell behind. Muda is addressed more in the Hajunka series. So what do I mean that waste doesn't occur in nature? Consider this example of a balanced ecosystem I learned as an elementary school student in the wonderful Florida public education system. This banana tree produces just enough bananas to produce the next generation of banana trees and to sustain a group of monkeys. The monkeys consume just enough bananas they need during any given meal and leave the rest on the tree. They don't hoard bananas and they don't dry them for trail mix. Next we have the natural predator of the monkey, the blue shark. The shark only consumes enough monkeys to sustain itself during that meal period. It doesn't hoard monkeys, nor does it take more monkeys than it needs for a large stockpile of monkey jerky. The shark also doesn't attempt to capture monkeys in an effort to farm them for mass consumption. It just consumes what's needed without greed when it's hungry and only until it's full. According to what I remember from the book, our blue shark eventually makes a final life journey upstream to pass away under a banana tree. Along the way, it lays eggs for the next generation of baby blue sharks. Just enough sharks make the journey to sustain the next generation of banana trees to provide fertilized soil. Notice that the perfect balance of sharks dies under the banana trees and they don't go through a mass beaching exercise together. Now this may not be exactly how the cycle of life works, but my elementary school education did open my eyes to our ability to live and consume harmoniously today in what I call an industrial ecosystem. Now enter man, who I'll call Mr. Muda, into our ecosystem. Waste is man-made, pure and simple. Greed and fear motivate him to hoard and waste rather than find ways to consume what is needed and find a way to mesh with the wonderful cycle of life. Mr. Muda immediately eats all the bananas he can. He then takes down the rest and dries them and sells them because who's to say that banana tree will produce more bananas tomorrow? He systematically catches and cages the monkeys because they may attack his stockpile of bananas. It looks like those pesky blue sharks are swimming awfully close to shore, perhaps close enough to net them all and eat. But who knew that blue shark steak spoiled so quickly in a tropical environment? Oh, and that tree looks kind of bare now without all those bananas. Let's go ahead and chop it down because who knows if it'll ever produce bananas again. This cycle of greed, fear, hoarding, and waste is common in business today. Instead of building relationships and trust with our suppliers and customers, we build walls and make them our enemies. This is no way to survive in today's industrial ecosystem. Take a moment and think. Are you finding ways to mesh with your suppliers and customers? Or are you trying to strip them of resources, cage them, cut them up into steaks, and chop them down? You, Mr. Muri, introduce fear and greed, and that motivates you to upset our balanced ecosystem. All of this manifests itself into waste. So here's a real-world example of how man can destroy a functioning ecosystem and cause waste. Look at this serene forest. I'm no tree hugger, but I also automatically don't want to chop them down and take them to a lumber mill. We chop down many acres of beautiful forests and hoard them in mills like this one. Along with taking more than what we need, we also create a ton of scrap that ends up in landfills. What remains as good wood is further processed and sent to sit and wait in depots like this one. We assume this wood is going to get consumed, but who really knows? Speculative construction caused by low interest rates in the mid-2000s caused a huge spike in demand for raw wood. Houses were shooting up in any piece of land that could be developed. Greed motivated average Joes to buy up multiple houses which they assumed they could sell for a huge profit later. Once the free market began to regulate prices, these average Joes and these speculative developers were stuck in contracts they could not fulfill. Construction came to a halt and neighborhoods were left half-built. Brand new and partially built houses were unsold and eventually ruined neighborhoods by attracting vandalism and other crime. Think of all the trees that were chopped down and all the waste we introduced into the system by being motivated by greed and fear. So waste really became prevalent when we moved into an agrarian society. We really lost the hunter's wisdom of finding one meal at a time. Instead, we moved to a society that farms huge batches, stores, and wastes. Now, don't get me wrong about the hunter's wisdom. I certainly do believe that a lot of good came out of moving into an agrarian society. I personally wouldn't want to be out hunting a deer every single day to eat something. But the problem I see here is going after something one piece at a time to shifting towards mass production, hoarding, and then wasting. The Industrial Revolution is another time we began wasting a lot as a society. Now, a lot of good, again, came out of the Industrial Revolution, but that's a time when we learned to mass produce again and hoard. Taiicho himself said we must learn to live as a society bravely and only take what we need. Around this time and after, people began mass producing and taking more than what they needed, and generally throwing away what they didn't use. So as I mentioned, waste is a byproduct of human thought. It doesn't occur in nature. In a balanced ecosystem, there is no waste. I want to close this waste section by saying lean is simple. All it is a business philosophy that says we need to waste less. When someone says they don't believe in lean, I wonder, do they want to add waste back into the system and somehow believe it's going to get better? Lean also teaches us that we need to add value quickly and one piece at a time, just like that hunter. Take a look at the value series to help close out this section.